welcome to the VPR and Vermont PBS debates. Tonight, we're partnering with 7 Days to bring you a debate with the Democratic candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm Mikaela Lefrak.
And I'm Chelsea Edgar. Joining us tonight in the Vermont PBS studio in downtown Winooski are State Senate President Pro Tem Becca Balint, Shanae Chase Clifford, Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray, and Dr. Lewis Myers. Welcome to the program.
Now, a note before we begin. Tonight's debate will be 90 minutes long. At 8 o'clock, NPR will begin live special coverage of the January 6th hearings in Congress. Our radio listeners will hear that coverage starting at 8. Viewers on Vermont PBS or online will not be affected. But if you're listening on the radio and you want to hear the full 90-minute debate, head to vpr.org for video streaming. We'll also rebroadcast the full debate on VPR tomorrow at noon.
Here's the format we'll use today and throughout the 2022 primary debates. In our first segment, we'll ask the same questions to all the candidates. They'll each have 60 seconds to answer. We may also ask short follow-up questions. In the second segment, the candidates will ask each other questions. Each candidate will be given 30 seconds to ask a question and 60 seconds to answer. They'll also have a chance to ask a follow-up question.
Then we'll turn to a series of questions submitted by Vermonters. Candidates will have 30 seconds to answer. We'll then have a lightning round of questions with very brief answers, 10 seconds or less. And we'll conclude with 1-minute closing statements from each candidate. All right, let's begin. We'll start with questions for all 4 of you, and please limit your answers to 60 seconds. And a reminder, Chelsea and I may ask follow-up questions. Question number 1. Many of you identify climate change as a top legislative priority. At the same time, many Vermonters are struggling with rising gas prices and energy costs. How would you decrease our country's dependence on fossil fuels in a way that is affordable to all Americans? And Senator Balint, let's start with you.
Thank you for the question. So I have been a champion on climate change during my time in the legislature. And one of the things that I've learned during that time is that Vermonters have a really hard time thinking about climate change and action without getting hopeless, without feeling like there's not a whole lot that they can do. So the first thing that I want to say to Vermonters tonight is that this is an incredible opportunity for us. It is a challenge. It is an existential crisis for us and our families, but we can use this as an opportunity to transition rural Vermont off of fossil fuels. And we can do this by making it more affordable for Vermonters to take advantage of in putting in solar panels or putting in fuel pumps. It's clear that the average Vermonter cannot afford to transition without our help. So it's going to take federal funds to help us to do this. The other thing that I want to say is we already have farmers across the state who are working really hard to sequester carbon in their soil. And so we have excellent models already here in the Vermont.
Now, Senator Balint, Governor Phil Scott this session vetoed the clean heat standard, which was the cornerstone of the session's climate legislation. And in retrospect, as the leader of the Senate, is there anything that you would have done differently?
You know, there really isn't anything I would have done differently because this was a recommendation that came directly from the Climate Council. So we set up the Climate Council by the Global Warming Solutions Act, which we passed, and the governor vetoed that, and we overrode the veto. And the recommendations that came out, one of the very top recommendations was what came to be known as the clean heat standard. We worked incredibly hard, not just within our committees, but with the administration to try to come to a compromise on this that the administration would get behind. And right up into the 11th hour, it seemed like we might have a compromise. I did everything that I could in the Senate to make sure that we had the votes to override the veto, which we anticipated. Unfortunately, the House did not have those votes.
Shanae Chase Clifford, how would you address climate change in a way that's affordable to all Vermonters and Americans?
Thank you. And I'm so excited to be here this evening. I think first we need to dispel a myth that removing fossil fuel subsidies makes gas more expensive for consumers, because many of the subsidies we have for the fossil fuel industry really do nothing for consumers and only serve to line the pockets of wealthy executives in the fossil fuel industry. For example, last in, first out accounting that allows fossil fuel companies to sell what's cheapest to you and keep what's more expensive for their, or flip it for their tax liability. So they sell what's more expensive to you and they keep what's cheaper for their tax liability. intangible drilling costs, which are about 60 to 80% of the costs of drilling for fossil fuel companies. They get to write off all of those costs. So again, that doesn't serve consumers. It only serves the most wealthy. And we see them racking in massive profits in the first quarter of this year. So we can do a lot to hold them accountable while also protecting consumers.
Now, about a third of Vermont's electricity comes from nuclear power plants across New England. Would you support building more nuclear power plants potentially in Vermont if it meant getting us closer to our emissions goals?
We certainly do need myriad energy solutions, and it's not going to be all on one particular energy source, but I do not support building more nuclear power plants. I think figuring out where to site them is going to be a huge equity issue. And obviously there is the question of what to do with waste and how safe it actually would be. So no, I do not support that.
Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray, how would you address climate change with an eye towards affordability?
I think affordability is the biggest challenge we have right now. I was at the pump down in Waterbury at the roundabout the other day, and a mom in a minivan started cursing at the pump. And I hear her. I think gas today is at, $5 a gallon? So Vermonters are suffering. I think there are short-term, medium-term, and long-term things we can do right now. First, we need to provide more access to LIHEAP for low-income Vermonters. We need to suspend the 18-cent federal gas tax, I think, to provide some immediate relief. We need to end fossil fuel subsidies and recognize that fossil fuel companies right now are making a windfall, not because the circumstances have necessarily changed here in Vermont or nationally, but because there's less fuel on the market. But the long term, or even the medium term, is what we've already started doing here in Vermont, getting more heat pumps into houses, weatherizing more homes, getting more Vermonters into electric vehicles, and we've been able to do that because of federal help. So as Vermont's Congresswoman, climate action will be a top priority, and knowing that at the federal level, we can do a tremendous amount for the state.
Now, Lieutenant Governor, you often talk about your seat at the table conversations that you've hosted with Vermonters as evidence of how you advocate for priorities like climate change. But outside of those conversations and the reports that you've written about them, can you name any tangible steps you have taken as Lieutenant Governor to address climate change?
Yeah, as soon as the legislative session ended last summer, I got in my car and drove to nearly every county in the state, spend a day per week in a county listening to Vermonters, showing up and really trying to understand how their lives have been impacted not only by COVID, but by all the things that Vermonters are facing every day, climate action, climate change, top among them. And I took some time when my tour ended to write a report for the governor and for the legislature with key recommendations from housing to workforce development. And I've used my office in the same way I would act as Vermont's Congresswoman, focusing on the issues that matter to Vermonters every day.
And sorry, I'd just like to clarify that question. It was about outside of the conversations and the reports that you've written, are there tangible steps that you have taken to address climate change?
Well, I'd like to think that some of the biggest investments being made in weatherization right here in Vermont and housing have been because of recommendations to the legislature.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis Myers, how would you address climate change with an eye towards affordability?
Well, I think that climate change is perhaps the most complex situation we're facing that we'll talk about tonight. And I like to keep things in perspective by looking at history, whether it's recent history or more remote history, because climate is a long-standing problem which has been developing for hundreds of years, probably since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I want to say I agree with Senator Ballant's comment. She said that one of the things we need to fight against is a feeling of hopelessness. Because what I think people hear is that this is an existential crisis, that it's overwhelming us. They can see on the news fires out west. But I think we also need to accentuate some of the positives. First of all, I can think back to 1988 when Dr. Hansen first started releasing the data and talking about climate warming. Relatively few people in this country believed him. I think that's changed. I think the majority of Americans now understand that our planet is warming. I think many of them also agree that human beings and their activities have a role in this. And I think that in itself is progress.
And I would love to hear a bit more on your specific priorities or strategies that you would take to address.
I think it's going to be multifaceted. We're going to need solar, wind, water, some fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. I do support nuclear power. I think it supplies actually 30% of our national power in this country. And it is becoming increasingly safe, particularly with the new generation of nuclear reactors. And also there's some hopeful things in the future using hydrogen and also the holy grail of fusion, which scientists are getting closer and closer to being able to tap into.
Thank you.
Our next question is about the Supreme Court. Given the likely repeal of the landmark abortion rights ruling in Roe v. Wade, many fear that other Supreme Court precedents, including marriage equality, could be vulnerable. How would you protect those precedents? And do you believe that modifying the court itself, such as imposing term limits or adding more seats, is part of the answer? Let's start with Sinead Chase-Clifford.
Yeah, it feels, especially as the Supreme Court nears the end of their session, it seems like we're going to see a lot of decisions that are incredibly damaging, including one today about immigration rights and sweeping ability for immigration enforcement officers to suspend your amendment rights. I think we have to think about what Congress can legislate to do and make sure that we're not shifting the responsibility solely over to the court. And we have to think about court reform. We have to think about doing those things in tangent. I've been saying that I don't think adding more members to the court is the answer because I want to see Congress do the work of legislating. But I do think that court reform is essential, and adding term limits or more incentives for Supreme Court justices to retire is also important parts of our conversations.
Codifying abortion access recently passed the House, but failed in the Senate. If elected to Congress, would you, on principle, support a bill that would likely fail, or would you seek some sort of compromise? And when it comes to Roe, what would you be willing to compromise?
Yes, I would absolutely support the Women's Health Protection Act. Even if legislation seems like it's going to fail, we saw that today with gun rights legislation. It's important to get members on the record of what they're willing to support. Even if it feels like we don't have the votes, we should absolutely still be pushing legislation through the floor. In terms of, sorry, what was the second part of the question?
What would you be willing to compromise when it comes to protecting Roe and the access to an abortion?
I think in terms of protecting abortion, Roe is the floor of just baseline bodily autonomy, and unencumbered access to reproductive health care is the floor. So I think we've compromised enough.
Thank you very much. All right, let's hear from Lieutenant Governor Gray. How would you protect important Supreme Court precedent, and do you believe that modifying the court itself is part of the answer?
I'll take the second question first. I don't support expanding the Supreme Court. I think it's a dangerous precedent to set, and if one party does that while they're in the majority, then we should expect that another party will do the same thing when they're majority. And when does it stop? I think that Congress has to legislate and to be held accountable to do so. What's so troubling about Roe v. Wade, and I know this as a lawyer, as a trained lawyer, someone who's dedicated her legal career to human rights, is that what we're seeing is not only an erosion of the right to privacy and the rights contained within it with the start of Roe, but the concern that what's next? Is it contraceptives? Is it equal marriage? And that's the moment that we're in. I think that's why right now having individuals who understand the Constitution, who understand the importance of these laws, the importance of these rights, and being ready to uphold them and to build coalitions in Congress to make sure that they're protected moving forward.
So how would you go about protecting those precedents?
I think first and foremost, doing everything we can to codify Roe v. Wade, first and foremost, voting rights, of course, where we see where we see the court starting to chip away at what we see and understand as fundamental rights. We need to see Congress stepping up and working together across the aisle to be able to do that.
All right, let's go to Dr. Lewis Myers. Do you need me to repeat the question?
No, thanks. I agree with my colleagues here. I would oppose expanding the Supreme Court for the reasons that Lieutenant Governor Gray just explained, that it sets a precedent. And the Republicans, majority might use that in the future to pack the court when they're in power. I do agree that term limits is something we should be looking at this point. 18 years has been suggested as a possible term limit for Supreme Court justices. We may want to look at the same term limits for federal judges who hold a great deal of power in this country. I think 18 years gives them enough experience and background on the court, but will allow new blood to come in. I want to talk briefly about the confirmation process, which is one of the most damaging events I think that has happened in this country in recent years. It's become a awful, vicious circus, whether it's a Democratic nominee or Republican nominee. And I think it's left some real scars on the public psyche.
Okay, that's all we have time for. How would you modify the confirmation process?
You know, I can remember a time when the ABA recommended federal judges and even recommended or gave their qualification certificate to nominees, and the president's choice was respected, barring any absolutely egregious information that had come forward. So I think it's just a matter of a mutual truce among Democrats and Republicans. Whether that's possible, I don't know. I just want to add very briefly, Ms. Gray talked about the legal aspects of what will come from overturning Roe versus Wade. I'm concerned as a physician that this is the court and the legal process basically telling physicians what procedures they can and cannot do. And again, I think there's a slippery slope in my profession as well.
All right, let's move on to Senator Balint.
So first, I want to say how inspiring it is to be on a stage with 4 candidates who all strongly support Roe, that is not the case throughout this country. And I want to just give credit where credit is due. I want to say that there was an incredible amount of foresight that happened in the House and Senate under my predecessor, Tim Ashe, and under the previous Speaker of the House, Mitzi Johnson, who anticipated, along with the majority leaders, that we were going to have to codify Roe here, and that we were going to have to take that extra step and make sure that it would be put into the Constitution. I agree with Ms. Chase Clifford. She said, we've compromised enough. That's how I feel. We've compromised enough. Our bodily autonomy is where we have to be focused on. Now, yes, we have to codify Roe. Yes, if it comes up for a vote, the Women's Health Protection Act, we have to get people on the record so that people are going to have to face their voters. We know the majority of Americans support Roe v. Wade.
Okay. Could you point to a specific moment in your career where you've managed to work with people with opposing views and have worked out a compromise?
Oh my gosh, all the time. That's the legislative process. And so when you think about the work that we did on the most recent housing bills, they had to go through many different permutations. We worked closely with the administration, the Scott administration. We worked closely with the minority leader in our chamber to make sure that at the end of the day, we would be able to deliver housing for Vermont. And now that was not an easy process, and we had to have a give and take. We didn't get everything that we wanted in my caucus, and the governor didn't get everything that he wanted. But what we did was deliver for Vermonters a housing package that we had all promised.
All right, let's move on. We've got a real choose your own adventure with this next question. What is the most pressing foreign policy challenge facing the United States today, and how do you begin to address it? Lieutenant Governor Gray, let's begin with you.
I think the Joint Chiefs have been saying for nearly a decade that climate change is one of the biggest national security challenges. I'd say it's also one of our biggest foreign policy challenges, and that's not to step away from what's happening in Ukraine, step away from the fact that our State Department and USAID have largely been gutted by the prior president. So we're still working to build back, to grow diplomacy, to have a real focus on foreign policy, which is extremely important. I think it's where we see prevention as an international human rights lawyer, as someone who's worked in conflict zones around the world, as someone who's worked for the Red Cross. I know that it's an area where we invest, we see the best results. But to bring it back to climate change, it's going to impact climate refugees, climate migrants. We're already seeing that here in Vermont. We're seeing sea level rise. So I think it is the top foreign policy challenge that we face, and one where we have to invest in climate diplomacy. I'm deeply proud to be endorsed by Todd Stern, the chief negotiator of the Paris Climate Agreement, and foreign policy for America from my foreign policy background.
Well, you brought up your experience in international human rights law, and I'm curious, Lieutenant Governor, how you would negotiate with a country like China, whose administration has been accused repeatedly of human rights violations on an issue like global trade.
Yeah, I think it's, first off, I've always believed and think it is true here today that where does human rights begin? As Eleanor Roosevelt once said, it begins in our communities at home. And here in the United States, we have to be walking the talk, both in how we take climate change seriously, in our own trade actions and policies, so that we show up at the table, be it with China, which the U.S. was able to get to the table on the Paris Agreement, be it with the United Nations, that we're showing up, leading by example, and with one voice. I think that's extremely important.
Dr. Lewis Myers, what is the biggest foreign policy issue facing the United States today?
I think when I look at the world in general, I think it's the increasing authoritarianism. Almost every region of the world, almost in country after country after country, has turned to authoritarian dictators. Democracy is on its back foot, and there are a number of reasons for that. Obviously, we're struggling in our own country right now to establish what kind of democracy we're going to be. But I think that there was a time when America set the example for the world. Perhaps as far back as John F. Kennedy was the last president I can imagine. The world looked to the United States not because we were the wealthiest country, but because we stood for something. And I think we need to stand for something again. And we need to ensure that the world knows that we do not tolerate dictators.
Well, you bring up authoritarianism. Of course, we are seeing a months-long now war with Russia and Ukraine, and the U.S. has spent more than $50 billion in this war so far. For you, is when does the U.S. start putting boots on the ground in a situation like Ukraine, and when do we hold back?
It's a very difficult question, and again, some of it. That decision lies with people in the military and with President Biden. My goal has always been to save lives. That's first and foremost as a physician. And if I looked at this situation, how can we save lives? We may look back and wonder if we had had 25,000 troops in a defensive posture before the invasion, would Vladimir Putin have invaded? We'll never know. We know the results now. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Over 6 million people have been uprooted and had to leave the country. The country is in ruins. I think we're doing what we can at this point. And I think that the aid that we've shared with Ukraine and the expertise, we've made it clear that we are on their side.
Thank you. Senator Balint, what is the most pressing foreign policy issue the U.S. faces today?
I think the most immediate one is, as Dr. Myers said, I believe it is the rise in authoritarianism and fascism, not just abroad, but at home. And as we look around the world, it's not just the conflict, the war, the brutal war in Ukraine right now. It is Viktor Orban in Hungary. It is Bolsonaro. It is Modi in India. It is a wave of authoritarianism and fascist tendencies. And it's very alarming that that tonight, right, we're going to be, well, we're not going to be able to watch it, but when we get home, we'll be able to watch the January 6 hearings about our own insurrection here. Now, I support what President Biden has done to stand strong with Ukraine. I wish we were doing more to stop the movement of money. I think Russian oligarchs often have a hand in not just what's happening in Ukraine right now, but in many of these places, including Belarus. And I think we have to take a harder line.
When you say stop the movement of money and take a harder line, can you elaborate? What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, so we have the ability to track money more carefully. Oh, I should be looking at the camera, not at you. Around, banking around the world. And we haven't taken all the steps that we can in order to stop that movement. And I think we have been hesitant to do that. And I think we ought to take that step.
Sinead Chase Clifford, what do you think is the most pressing foreign policy challenge our country faces today?
I have to agree with Lieutenant Governor Gray in saying climate change. We are currently looking at a situation in which island nations will be underwater, not in 50 to 80 years, but in 5 to 10 years. And climate change will only exacerbate the crises we're seeing around the world. We're still fighting over limited resources, limited natural resources, and we're still fighting over land. And so where are these people going to go? Where are these people going to be able to live? We need to be thinking about that now, as we saw with the pandemic, which again will happen more often because of climate change. We have to be prepared. We have to be thinking about these now and within our own borders as we see our coastal cities under imminent threat because of climate catastrophe, and how we are going to support our international community in making sure that people have a place to live and are still able to live thriving lives.
Well, you bring up migrants and immigration.
Yeah.
Now we have a crisis at the southern border, of course, which could only be exacerbated by climate change. What is one step that you would take to address the border crisis?
Well, it is frustrating. I think that the administration set a date for the sunset of Title 42, which is the Remain in Mexico policy, without a plan. We need to focus on how we are going to be trauma responsive to people who are coming over the border. And they are coming to our border because they're leaving their homes in incredibly traumatic ways. So we need to make sure that when they show up, we're able to wrap them in the care and compassion they deserve. And we need systemic immigration reform centered around pathways to citizenship. It is crucial for the livelihood of a state like ours that is going to certainly need a vibrant migrant community to support our economy, and it's necessary for the stability of our nation as well.
Thank you.
Our next question deals with racism and racial inequality. From slavery to the recent massacre in Buffalo, America has a long history of racism. How can the federal government protect Black lives, and what specific national policies would you support to address racial inequality in the U.S.? We'll start with Dr. Myers.
That's a loaded question, for sure. The federal government, one of the things, of course, we've been concerned about is disparities in police response to Black citizens. President Biden has just announced that there will be a national accreditation of police departments, which I think will help. There's going to be more tracing or tracking of police officers who have abused their power. That will help. It's been a long process. We go back 200, obviously over 200 years, and I think finding the right answers is going to be challenging. I think there are areas where we can look at specifically. Black farmers, for example, have been certainly had their loans denied.
That is time. Congress has historically been made up of older white men, and many people believe that reinforces systemic racism in this country. Do you agree? And if so, why should Vermonters send another white man to Congress?
You know, I don't. I appreciate that people of color bring a certain perspective and perhaps their own history, but I think we generalize when we say that any white man would not know what they've experienced. I grew up actually in Washington, D.C., a city that at the time was 70% Black when I was growing up. I worked as a probation officer in Washington, D.C. I worked as a reserve uniformed police officer in Washington, D.C. I know, just based on my experiences, those experiences, also I went to medical school and residency and served all of Washington, D.C. I know the challenges people face. I've walked those neighborhoods. I've been in their homes.
Okay, and that is all we have time for. Senator Balint, to you.
So this is a really sweeping issue, and it requires sweeping change. And it touches all aspects of our life, not just criminal justice reform, not just wealth inequality, but also looking at, specifically at the issue of voter suppression. And so I want us to really understand why we have such an intense wealth gap right now. it was by design. It was created that way. So all those Black men coming home from World War II wanting to take advantage of the GI Bill, and they couldn't. They couldn't take advantage of it. They couldn't get low interest loans. They couldn't get wealth equity in their homes. And so we are continuing this wealth inequality. And so the first thing we have to do is acknowledge that it was by design, and we can undo that.
And what specific policies would you support in order to undo that?
So we have to pass the George Floyd Policing Act. We have to pass the John Lewis Voting Protection Act. You know, you just spoke about it, right? We do not have a Congress that is representative of our nation as a whole. It's not. And we have to, as Vermonters, think about how we can support the movement to elect more people of color into Congress. And it is critically important that we understand that money that we spend towards this process is going to help generations to come. It's not just in the now.
All right, and I'm going to ask you one more follow-up question. Sure. You co-sponsored a bill in the Vermont Senate to end qualified immunity, which would have opened a new legal pathway for victims of police violence. But the Senate yielded to pressure from law enforcement, and the bill was ultimately reduced to a commitment to study the issue. How can Vermonters be confident that you will stand up to opposition on similar issues?
Well, so I really appreciate the question, because I wouldn't characterize it as just a situation where people buckle to pressure. I'm putting words in your mouth, but buckling to pressure from law enforcement. There were lots of people within that committee and on the Senate floor who felt like we needed more time to really understand the issue itself. I believe we need to end qualified immunity, and I co-sponsored that bill because of my belief in that, and I will continue that fight in Congress.
Okay, thank you. And now Sinead Chase-Clifford.
Racism is embedded in every single one of our policy choices. And we have to think about the reparative work that comes along with all of our future policy choices. Canceling student debt. Black borrowers have a higher burden of student debt and also are more likely to default because of their student debt. Making sure that we pass HR 1, which I believe goes a little bit further. I do support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but HR 1, the For the People Act, which has critical investments in campaign finance and restructuring of campaign finance and voter support. The Breathe Act, the Free College for All Act, Medicare for All Act, all of these things are going to have a rising effect on all parts of our communities. And when we center Black and brown folks and the folks who are most vulnerable within our communities, the entire community flourishes. So a number of policy choices that are consistent with progressive values that'll support not only Black folks, but our entire communities.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned a number of policies there that would likely be met with opposition.
Sure.
And how would you work with that opposition? How would you deal with that in Congress?
Well, you know, that there has to be conversations, and I think thinking a little bit differently about how we approach some of these issues, you know, on how we thinking about restructuring our systems of policing. I think having those conversations on Twitter is not helpful, but talking to folks about having a real honest conversation about fractures in trust and broken relationships. And throwing money at a broken relationship is not going to fix it. So restructuring how we think about these conversations as opposed to, you know, I have a moral high ground and if you disagree with me, you are immoral. But reframing our conversations, reframing the narrative to talk about how do we shift a broken relationship and invest in the parts of our policy platforms that actually will get at root causes as opposed to further entrenching ourselves into structures of racism.
Thank you. And now Lieutenant Governor Gray.
I think it's important to start with the first part of the question, which was around what happened in Buffalo. I was so impressed with Governor Hochul, former Lieutenant Governor, now Governor Hochul of New York, who came out and identified and recognized what had happened for what it was. White supremacy, violent domestic extremism, if you will, I think it's important to call out that when we see it and to work to prosecute it as such. Moving forward, I agree with so much of what Ms. Clifford said. We have to recognize where systemic racism exists, not only in access to housing, access to transportation, access to education, access to healthcare, access to reproductive care, and access to the ballot box, access to voting. And there are a number of efforts in Congress right now, be it the LIFT Act around housing, be it the John Lewis Voting Act around voting, be it paid family and medical leave, be it codifying road. There's so many efforts right now that I believe would begin to address, but to underline that it's just the beginning, but begin to address a systemic racism that exists in this country.
Okay, and you've stated before that you do not support defunding the police. How do you propose dealing with systemic racism in policing?
Well, and I have said that, and I will stand by it. I think the answer is additional training and making sure that we are training law enforcement officers. We are also holding them accountable, making sure that we are banning chokeholds. I support President Biden's recent efforts, making sure we have body cameras on every law enforcement officer, not only in the state, but in the nation. As a former assistant attorney general who worked in the criminal division, I know it's a lot easier to prosecute when we have the evidence, when we have information, and making sure that we can hold law enforcement accountable.
Thank you. Let's move on. Some Vermonters believe in responsible gun ownership. Others want to see a completely gun-free society. Where do you fall on this spectrum, and how will your experiences as a Vermonter help you convince your future colleagues to follow your vision? Senator Balint, let's start with you.
So I want to say that, first up, we don't have to live with these horrors that we've been seeing. We do not need to watch our children being slaughtered in school or people being killed at a grocery store. This isn't normal, and we actually can do something about it. It's not the price of our freedom. And I think that it isn't a choice between whether we can have these horrible things happening or have, sensible gun ownership. We already have many people in Vermont who have sensible and responsible gun ownership. But, when I was a teacher, I saw firsthand what we had to do to get our students ready for an active shooting, and no kid should have to go through that. We have passed numerous laws in Vermont on gun safety under my leadership, and the sky didn't fall. It did not fall. We still have a very healthy gun culture here, and we know that it saves lives.
Now, we just hosted the debate for the Republican candidates running for this House seat, and some of those candidates said that we should be arming our teachers. If you were to be elected to the House, how would you start that conversation with somebody who believes something so different than what you believe?
Well, it starts by meeting people where they're at. And I, like most people, have gun owners in my family, and I understand that there's always an opportunity to talk about shared values. So I had many conversations on the floor of the Senate in Vermont with a colleague who strongly believed that everybody should have a gun in their home. And we talked about what does it mean to feel safe, and that different people feel safe with different situations. Some people feel safer with a gun, some people actually feel safer without. And so it is about talking about shared values that you can make that connection.
Thank you. Sinead Chase Clifford.
It is horrifying and deeply traumatic. The past few weeks we have lived through together. And it's mass shootings, and it's also now mass shootings feel like an everyday occasion. I got a news alert before walking out to the studio about a mass shooting in Maryland. And this is people's everyday lives. There's a statistic that every month 70 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner with a firearm, and that number is already low because it's not inclusive of trans women and non-binary individuals. So this is a lived reality outside of what we see, that reaches the top of the headlines. I believe you need a permit to purchase. That's inclusive of red flag laws, universal background checks, and better data collection. I believe if you need a permit to fish, you can have a permit to buy a firearm. Sorry, please go ahead.
Would you support any sort of national gun registry?
Yes. And that data exists. The gun manufacturers do keep your information and sell it. And I think having a national registry is actually more accountable. That data is already being captured.
Well, again, to Vermonters or to Americans who hear that and fear that you or the U.S. government is coming for their guns, what do you say to them?
We have to be able to have conversations about it. I don't necessarily draw the connection between registering a firearm and how that if you intend to use your firearm for reasonable purposes and not to harm individuals, then national. I guess I would really want to understand where that is coming from, and that's me as a social worker want to get to the bottom of where that fear resides in, and how can we heal that versus jumping to a policy conclusion that I think is grounded in another feeling.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Gray.
I grew up in rural Vermont, and growing up, hunters would come onto our property to hunt. We'd see hunters in the woods, and I think that it's important to be really, really clear that responsible gun ownership is actually a lot of the measures that folks are advocating for right now, and certainly ones that I agree with. But before talking about that, I just want to recognize, one thing that's really stuck with me and it's hard to get out of my head is the weapon that was used in Uvalde, and the doctor who has been talking about the children that came to the ER. It's a weapon that left children unidentifiable. And I think what we have to be really clear about is that we do not need weapons of war in our streets. We don't need them in our schools. We don't need them in places of worship or in our stores. We don't need high-capacity magazines. And responsible gun ownership is recognizing that. Responsible gun ownership is safe storage. It's expanding background checks. It's expanding red flag laws. It's closing the Charleston loophole. It's making sure that we're doing everything we can right now to protect people, to save lives, and to protect children.
Okay. Well, Lieutenant Governor, many of your potential colleagues in the House believe in similar types of legislation as the ones that you've been referencing. They also passed a gun control package this week that will almost certainly fall apart in the Senate. So other than drafting or voting for similarly doomed legislation, what will you do to reduce gun violence in our country?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that if we can come together as a nation around support for Ukraine, against Russia, in protecting civilian life, how is it that we can't come together in this country right now to protect Americans, to protect citizens, to protect children? And what I hope we'll see in the Senate is that there will be a place where Republicans and Democrats can come together in the same way that they have around Ukraine. And even if it's starting with background checks, even if it's starting with expanded access to safe storage and getting weapons that don't belong on our streets off our streets.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis Myers.
One of the things I would do would be to support the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. That's a federal agency staffed by really talented, capable, dedicated people. Unfortunately, the Republicans have starved it of funds over the years, as they have the IRS. But these are people who know what they're doing, and they're out to get the bad guys. They're not out to get law-abiding citizens. So I would support increased funding for ATF. I also agree at renewing the 1994 ban on assault rifles. They don't protect homes. A shotgun does just as well. I think we should remember that handguns still cause the great majority of fatalities, gun fatalities in this country. There'll probably be 100 people tomorrow killed across the country by handguns. So we need to continue the focus on handguns. I would support background checks on all purchases, including from family members, and as Ms. Clifford Brown said, permits for ownership.
That is time, and I do want to ask you a question about handguns since you brought them up. A hypothetical here. Say somebody entered your home, a friend, an acquaintance, and they told you that they had a handgun with them. You ask why, and they say they fear for their safety. How do you respond?
Well, they shouldn't have to fear for their safety in my house, well, I think Ms. Clifford Brown brings up a good point. Let's sit down and talk about it. Maybe they have reason to be fearful. Maybe they've been an abused partner. So I would want to know more about what that specific person's fearing. I do want to say I would also support a 5-year mandatory minimum for any crime committed with a gun. And I know mandatory minimums have been controversial because they've sent people to prison for decades for ticky-tacky crimes. But I think it would send a clear message in this country that and the Republicans say it's not guns that cause things, it's bad people. So let's go after the bad people. If you commit a crime that has a handgun, you're going to jail for 5 years, minimum.
Thank you. And I just wanted to clarify, candidate's name is Shanae Chase Clifford.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Well, that concludes the first segment of the debate. When we come back, the candidates will have an opportunity to ask each other questions. I'm Chelsea Edgar.
And I'm Mikaela Lefrak. Now, before we take a break, a reminder that those listening on the radio will hear live NPR special coverage of the January 6th hearings in Congress starting at 8 o'clock. Viewers on Vermont PBS or online, stay with us. This is the debate with the Democratic candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives, brought to you by VPR, Vermont PBS, and 7 Days.
Brian just threw away the rule book.
The level of musicianship, I don't think anybody's touched it yet.
People say Brian's a genius.
And the pressure that comes with that.
You know there's something going on with Brian Wilson.
The idea of doing an interview makes Brian nervous, so he'll often ask if we can just take a drive and listen to some music.
The rooftop is down. The story begins.
It was a trip.
Premieres Tuesday at 9 on Vermont PBS.
Hi, I'm Mikaela Lefrak.
And I'm Connor Cyrus. Together, we host Vermont Edition on VPR.
VPR-Vermont PBS will be hosting a series of primary debates.
And we want to hear from you. To ask your questions to the candidates, visit our website, vpr.org, under the VPR-Vermont PBS icon.
This is the VPR and Vermont PBS primary debate with the Democratic candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives, brought to you in partnership with 7 Days. I'm Mikaela Lefrak, coming to you live from the Vermont PBS studio in downtown Winooski.
And I'm Chelsea Edgar. Joining us for tonight's debate are Shanae Chase Clifford, Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray, Dr. Lewis Myers, and State Senate President Pro Tem Becca Balint.
The candidates now have an opportunity to ask each other questions. The questions should be no longer than 30 seconds, so no grandstanding, please. And as a reminder, you can ask a brief follow-up question or use that time to ask another candidate your question. So let's get to it. Lieutenant Governor Gray, we will start with you.
Thank you. I'll begin with a question for Ms. Balint. Already over $53 million in super PAC money has poured into Democratic primaries across the country, mostly television ads. Bernie Sanders has said, and I quote, "Super PAC money is not welcome in Democratic primaries." On this one, I agree with Bernie. Will you join me tonight in making two commitments? First, to publicly reject any outside group spending in this primary. And second, should any groups put up ads, join me in a joint press conference the next day denouncing them and demanding the ads be taken down.
Yes.
No further questions.
All right. Do you have any follow-up questions for another candidate, or do you like to yield your time?
I'll yield my time.
All right, that one was efficient.
All right. Our next question is from Dr. Lewis Myers. Go ahead, Dr. Myers.
I guess I'll ask Ms. Gray this, and because you just brought up campaign financing, and of course you're raised and grew up here in Vermont. But if I look at the figures from the last filing, it looked like 45% of your funds had been raised from out of state, unless I'm wrong about that. 51,000 from New York, 39,000 from San Francisco, 98,000 from DC, including companies all over the country, including American Crystal Sugar, which grows sugar beets in North Dakota, almost $12,000 from the University of California. Can you talk about that a little bit in terms of the question you just asked?
Sure. I think there's some inaccuracies there, so I'll get right to the point. First and foremost, Vermonters should know that as a candidate for lieutenant governor, as a candidate for Congress, I have not and will not accept a dime of corporate or corporate PAC money. Vermonters can judge all of the donations to my campaign for themselves. You can go to the FEC reports. We disclose every single dollar. Also, I'm not taking any money from fossil fuel executives or lobbyists. I've taken the fossil fuel pledge. I have worked for nearly half a decade in and with Congress. I have the support of more than 20 former chiefs of staff, 2 White House chiefs of staff. I have the support of many of the folks who have supported Senator Leahy and Congressman Welch over the years. And I think many of the supporters who look at the campaign know that they have the ability to lead. I had the experience to be an incredibly good Congresswoman, but I'm most deeply proud of the support from Vermonters from over 210 towns. And I will always show up for Vermont.
Would you like to ask a follow-up question, Dr. Myers?
Well, again, that if almost half of the funds are coming from outside of Vermont, certainly those are people that support you, but I guess American Crystal Sugar, do you know?
Yeah, let me talk about American Crystal Sugar. It's a cooperative, a co-op of sugar beet farmers. We used to feed sugar beets to the cows, but you can also, it turns out, make sugar from sugar beets. They support Democrats, Republicans who care about agriculture. I grew up on a farm. I care deeply about agriculture and will be a champion for Vermont's farmers if elected to Congress.
One of my own experiences.
That's all the time. Sorry. Unfortunately, we have to move on.
Third in our series of questions, we have Senator Ballant. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you. This is to the, I'd like to ask it of everyone. I think it's a simple question. Okay.
We have time.
I sometimes feel that as Democrats, we too often fall victim to infighting, and we lose sight of who the real opponents are, being the folks in Congress who supported the insurrection, folks who supported Donald Trump's rise to power and are working against our democracy. So I commit tonight to supporting whoever the Democratic nominee is and working hard to get them elected. Does everybody agree to this?
Lieutenant Governor Gray, let's begin with you.
Absolutely, without question.
Absolutely.
I will have to see how it turns out.
Do you have any follow-up questions?
I do not.
All right, and now Shanae Chase Clifford, ask a question.
Yeah, I think a fitting follow-up, Senator Ballant, you have said, as we just all answered, that you will support the Democratic nominee no matter what. But you've also said that certain candidates would be catastrophic if they won. So how do you reconcile those two statements?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I will say that I certainly meant no offense by that comment, and if I did offend, I apologize. I think that in politics, sometimes there is spicy rhetoric. And my point was that I think it is really important, and it goes to what Dr. Myers was saying, is that I think we need to look at where money is coming from, and we need to look at the issue of campaign finance reform. And I really want someone representing us in Congress who is going to be taking campaign finance reform seriously. But I will support whoever the nominee is.
Nothing further.
All right, this concludes the second segment of our debate. When we come back, the candidates will answer questions submitted by Vermonters. I'm Chelsea Edgar.
And I'm Mikaela Lefrak. This is the debate with the Democratic candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives on VPR and Vermont PBS.
Since 1982, Vermont This Week has been a trusted source for local news and information.
I'm Stuart Ledbetter, and this is Vermont This Week.
Vermont's top journalists delve into the most important news stories each week and discuss the important issues that are shaping our state and the impact they have on your community. Join us for Vermont This Week's 40th season every Friday at 7:30.
Hi, I'm Mikaela Lefrak.
And I'm Connor Cyrus. Together, we host Vermont Edition on VPR.
VPR-Vermont PBS will be hosting a series of primary debates.
And we want to hear from you. To ask your questions to the candidates, visit our website, vpr.org, under the VPR-Vermont PBS icon.
Welcome back to the primary debate with the Democratic candidates for U.S. House on VPR and Vermont PBS in partnership with 7 Days. I'm Chelsea Edgar.
And I'm Mikaela Lefrak. With us tonight are Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray, Dr. Lewis Myers, State Senate President Pro Tem Becca Balint, and Shanae Chase Clifford.
It's time now for some questions from Vermonters. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Just a reminder, candidates, to please limit your answers to 30 seconds. We'll start with a question from Steve and Sharon, who asks, will you pledge to join Senator Sanders' work to reduce the military budget? Will you call for halting F-35 fighter jet training flights in Vermont? We'll start with Dr. Myers.
I would like to see the F-35s relocated. I think that the overall cost, benefit, and risk to Burlington residents and Chittenden County residents is I would like to see the F-35s relocated. No, I would not support across-the-board reductions in the military budget. I would certainly welcome to be on the Armed Services Committee and look at the budget carefully and make sure that we're using the money efficiently. But America still plays a huge role in the world. The world looks to us, and we're going to need the military.
Okay, and because we have some extra time, we do have time for some follow-ups. Why would you not support reducing the military budget?
I mean, I think that's a global statement. There are major areas of waste, I'm sure, and pork in the military budget, and vested interests. But I think just saying that we're going to cut the budget across the board is that's using a meat cleaver when we need to use a surgical scalpel. We need to have an effective, efficient military, but we need a military, and we've seen that. We see that now in Ukraine, and we're going to see it in the future. China's watching what we do with our budget.
Okay, thank you. And now Senator Balint.
So I will take the second part first, which is I support the Guard and I support the mission. I know that having the F-35s here is an important economic resource both for the region and for the airport. However, I do know from talking, I'm from the southern part of the state, and I'm coming up to speed on the F-35s, and my understanding is that there is a severe noise pollution problem. And it goes to the other point, which is I think we need to hold the military accountable for spending $1.7 trillion on the F-35s on a plane that clearly is not meeting its needs, our needs.
Would you support relocating the F-35s?
I would not support unilaterally moving the F-35s because I've been doing my research on this, and I know there are communities across the country that are dealing with this very same issue. And I think we have a responsibility to make sure our Guard can be ready to be activated.
All right, now we'll go to Shanae Chase Clifford.
I oppose the current basing of the F-35, so would support their relocation. And yes, I do support reducing our military spending. I don't think it is, we'll just cut off a top line. We need to make sure that people and care and compassion are central in all of our appropriations bills, but especially our military spending. I have a brother who's in his 21st year serving in the United States Air Force, and he can't get childcare on base. So we need to make sure that we're investing in our people and our service members while also making sure we're not lining the pockets of big contractors.
Okay, and where would you propose relocating the F-35s? What would be an appropriate place for them?
I think we'd have to have a conversation about it, and also want to, wherever that is proposed. I mean, I want to know if they need to be based anywhere. But I think that's a conversation to have with proposed communities. And that conversation was had in the community now, and we were told different things than what is reality. And community has since said, we do not want these here. So I think wherever they go, if they have to go someplace, we have to make sure that we are centering the needs of that community. And if they would like them there, then sure. But they should know the full scope of information before choosing to have them based in their community.
All right, and now we go to Lieutenant Governor Gray.
I think it's important to recall at the outset that it is because of the leadership of Senator Sanders and Senator Leahy and Congressman Welch, and I believe our Governor Phil Scott, that the F-35s are here in Vermont. What I see as the greatest challenge and where we need to redouble our efforts is on noise mitigation. We hear that from constituents here in South Burlington and Winooski. That is our biggest challenge. When it comes to defense spending, yes, our defense spending is far too much. It's outdated in some areas. I strongly support investments in the State Department, in USAID, which I think are our greatest tools in diplomacy, and especially now, given the challenges we face across the world.
So you're saying that you would not support relocating the F-35s, just to be clear, but you would support noise mitigation? What does that mean?
I would not support relocating. I think that our Guard has done a tremendous job having the F-35s here. I've been a big supporter of the Guard as Lieutenant Governor. I'm a proud sister and daughter of 2 vets. What does noise mitigation mean? It means doing everything we can to support homes and families and communities in the pathway, in the flight pathway of the F-35s, making sure that we continue to look at when the F-35s are flying and training to do everything we can to reduce the disruption.
And let's move on to our next question. Now, we've received a number of messages ahead of this debate about the rising costs of healthcare. Lee in Bennington asks, millions of older Americans rely on Medicare for health insurance. As a congressperson, how would you address some voters' concerns about the ongoing privatization of the Medicare system? Let's begin with you, Senator Balint.
So I'm a big proponent of Medicare for all. I want to say that at the outset. But I also know from talking to seniors around the state that they have concerns that it's not actually meeting their needs as it currently exists. So not dealing with vision and dental and mental health care. So I think if we are able to move towards Medicare for all, it has to be much more comprehensive. And we also have to make sure that we can have our government negotiating directly for lower cost of pharmaceuticals. I know that is a complaint I hear all the time.
And can you speak to how this might be a larger issue here in Vermont, where there is an aging population? How does the state cover that?
We do have an aging population here, but that's true for all of New England. So it's a challenge that we have to look to our surrounding states for guidance. Really, we can't go it alone, and that is what we've learned in the last few years. Is that our challenges are not unique to Vermont, though we feel them most acutely here, and so. As we look ahead to a continuing population that is going to continue to age, we have to make sure that the things that are offered through Medicare are things that are geared towards an older population. We can't lose sight of our elders.
And Sinead Chase-Clifford, how would you address the rising cost of healthcare and the potential privatization of Medicare?
Right, we are seeing increasing private equity coming in and scoop practitioners, driving costs and eroding care. One significant way we see that is through direct care entities and the REACH program, which essentially puts folks in Medicare into Medicare Advantage type plans without their knowledge. And this becomes a surprise to folks. We only have one direct care entity, I believe, in Vermont, but folks who are Medicare recipients need to know what type of plans they're getting and can't be duped and find out at the end of the day that they actually were scooped into a Medicare Advantage-like plan. So we need to end that program and make sure folks are very clear about their health care and have autonomy in the coverage they get.
And what other role can the federal government play in making sure that Vermonters and Americans are not, as you say, duped by their healthcare system?
Right. Well, certainly, the Trump administration bolstered these direct care entities so the Biden administration can reduce them significantly. Also making sure that we are fully covering hearing, dental, and vision, and moving towards a systemic reform of our healthcare system. And as we get there, making sure we're protecting our seniors and folks who are covered by Medicare.
Thank you. And Lieutenant Governor Gray, how would you address rising costs of healthcare in the U.S.?
We are one of the oldest states in the nation. And as was mentioned earlier, we're going to see more and more Vermonters accessing Medicare. We need to do everything we can to protect Medicare access here in the state, but also to expand it to dental, to vision, to hearing. We also see some steps to privatize the VA. We don't need that either, with so many Vermonters, so many veterans accessing VA benefits, which in many ways are Medicare benefits. I certainly believe that we have to have a federal government that's able to negotiate prescription drug costs to get those under control, not only here in Vermont, but across the state. As Lieutenant Governor, I proudly supported investments in a health and human services workforce. We have a nursing shortage. We have a health worker shortage across the state. It's really an all hands on deck moment for healthcare access in the state.
And Lieutenant Governor, what lessons do you think the COVID-19 pandemic taught us about government-sponsored healthcare?
Well, I think the pandemic taught us that whether you're employed or not, we had a lot of Vermonters fortunately have to leave the workforce during the pandemic. And if your healthcare is tied to employment, you're in a really tough place. So I certainly support, Medicare for all. But the biggest concern I see right now is if Republicans take back the House, it's not going to be Medicare for all. It's going to be Medicare for none. So we need to do everything we can right now to fight to protect the Affordable Care Act and the care that's provided to more than 26,000 Vermonters.
Thank you. And Dr. Lewis Myers, I'm guessing you've been waiting for a healthcare question.
Well, I am. And in some ways, because of my experience as a physician for so many years, this is such a complex problem. We could be here all night talking about it, honestly. I agree with what each of my colleagues has said. I think the biggest driver of healthcare costs in this country, more than technology, more than the pharmaceuticals, is consolidation. And we see this across various industries in this country. President Biden is beginning to move on a more aggressive antitrust path. He hasn't really begun to approach medical care, though. Consolidation of these big corporate entities, buying up hospitals, buying up nursing homes, buying up practices has driven the cost up tremendously.
Well, with an eye towards Vermont, where it can be very expensive to run a hospital in a small town, how do you balance those costs while also, pushing back against this consolidation that you're speaking of?
Well, I think Vermont is Exhibit A. We've seen the University of Vermont basically swallow healthcare in much of the state, and all we've seen is prices going up and up and up as they've established their monopoly, driving the Blue Cross premiums up, driving all healthcare costs up. They charge 2 to 3 times often for the same service as what an independent would do. So I think we need to understand that independent hospitals and independent practices still have value. In fact, they have perhaps more value than ever. They provide excellent quality care.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Jessica in Burlington, who asks, what is the most difficult vote you have ever had to cast and why? And if you've never cast a vote before, what is the most difficult public decision you've ever had to make, or most difficult decision you've had to make in your career, and why? We'll start with Shanae Chase Clifford.
Well, I've certainly made, I know the question is about legislative votes, but voting is always a really important duty we all have. So I feel like I've made important votes there. But certainly in my personal life would be just to decide to run and to do this, which is incredibly difficult, especially for someone like me who isn't often encouraged, even now still is not encouraged to continue to do this, and really had to be strong in my conviction and know that this is a place I need to be. And that certainly was a difficult decision, and happy every day that I made it.
All right, let's move on to Lieutenant Governor Gray.
In my first term as Lieutenant Governor, a few months in, there was a proposal put forward by the treasurer of our state and taken up by the pro tem and the speaker that ultimately required that the pensions of a number of teachers, of the state teachers and also state employees be largely cut. And after a lot of thought, to come forward and to publicly say that it wasn't something I agreed with, that I thought it went too far. It took a lot of courage for me as a new lieutenant governor. But I'm really proud of that courage, because today I think we're finally at a place where not only have pensions been preserved, but they went through the legislative process and the legislature overrode the governor's veto. So with courage also comes strong results.
That's time. And what exactly did you do to help that process?
I came forward and made a very public statement, which is something as lieutenant governor I do with rarity. I believe when you speak, you have to know why and to know why and to do it clearly. And so I came forward and made a public statement articulating to Vermonters why I didn't think it was the right step forward. And then Within the next week, we saw the process slow down a bit. And then what ensued was an extremely thoughtful process that I think led to an outcome that we can all stand by today.
All right, Dr. Myers.
Well, I don't know that I've made many public decisions such as Ms. Gray's or Ms. Balance. I have spent 30 years making very, I would say, private decisions with patients, life and death decisions. I don't think a day has gone by in the last 30 years when I was at work, and several years before that as a probation officer with child abuse cases, that I wasn't involved in making some decision that touched on life and death matters. And living with the consequences. Not every decision turns out the way we would want it. So I think it builds a certain fortitude, and I think when there are tough votes to be taken in Congress, I'll remember the difficult moments that I've had because they may pale in comparison the congressional votes compared to what I've been through.
Is there a situation that you've encountered in your practice that has informed you or shaped your view on a specific policy?
You know, I had a practice, this was in Alexandria, Virginia, for many years, my own practice, and I welcomed everyone, whether they had insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, or uninsured. And I think it gave me a great sense of the community and how difficult it is to provide care when other needs, social needs, are not being met. I remember one very specific morning when I had the governor of our state in his pinstripe suit sitting on one side of my waiting room and a little homeless man sitting in the other. And I was just so glad to have them both there because I think that that's what we should be doing in healthcare. We can't leave anyone behind.
Okay, thank you very much. And now Senator Ballant.
Really appreciate the question. I want to start by saying there's a difference between standing up for an issue and publicly talking about an issue and having to take a vote on an issue. And in my over a decade of serving in roles that required me to vote, not just in the legislature, nearly a decade in the legislature, but also on the Development Review Board of my town. And as a town meeting member in my town, I've had to take hundreds of difficult votes because every vote is serious. You have to think very carefully about how you vote, and you have to face the voters at the post office, in the grocery store. You have to be able to explain why you did what you did, and that takes incredible fortitude.
Could you talk about a specific vote?
Absolutely. I would be delighted. I had to, early in my career, vote in opposition to a bill that the sitting Democratic governor supported, and it was a bill for legalization of marijuana at the time. And I had strong concerns about the farmers in my area who had been supplementing their income with marijuana for years, for several generations. And I felt like it was going to be a big grow marijuana bill that was going to concentrate the wealth in more populated areas. And that was a very difficult vote.
We have one more question from a listener. Maria in Stratford asks us, it's predicted Vermont won't suffer as much as other places from the impacts of climate change, so we'll likely see climate refugees moving here over the next few decades. How do we welcome climate refugees without making Vermont more unaffordable? And candidates, we've spoken a bit already tonight about climate change, about climate refugees, and I'd really love to hear from each of you about this issue of affordability and what role you as a congressperson could play in keeping our state and our entire country a bit more affordable for regular Americans. And let's begin with Lieutenant Governor Gray.
It's such an important question. I was today speaking with the Vermont Ski Association, and we're expected to lose a month of winter in the next several decades. So climate change is going to impact us. We already have documented climate refugees moving to Vermont, and we see this impacting a number of different areas, certainly housing. But to really get to the question of affordability, I think that really brings me to the heart of why I'm running for Congress. We know when we have a federal government and congressional delegation that steps up for Vermont, be it in supporting childcare access, which is some of the most expensive in the country, supporting housing development in the state, supporting hopefully access to paid family and medical leave. This gets at the cost of living in Vermont, and that's why we have to have strong, bold, Vermont-focused federal leadership right now.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis Myers.
Well, let's remember, not all of the climate refugees, at least initially, will be lower socioeconomic. I mean, we've seen refugees coming here post-COVID or during COVID. And most of those were people who had some money. They didn't just relocate from the Bronx, South Bronx, to come to Vermont. These were people coming here with money, and they have inflated the housing market in many of our communities. So this was unexpected. I think we have some lead time with true climate refugees. And I agree with Lieutenant Governor Gray. We're going to have to put programs in place, and we're going to have to start building the housing, building out the schools now, or we will have some difficulties.
Thank you. Senator Ballant.
So yeah, I will just say, we actually did see the housing crisis coming, and we've been working on it for years in the legislature and have made huge investments in housing and in childcare, supporting higher wages. And we have been working really hard to support families. We have to continue to do that. One concrete step that the federal government can take is really dedicating more money for infrastructure for smaller municipalities to build out water and sewer, to build where we want to build more housing, which is in our downtowns.
Thank you. And Shanae Chase Clifford.
I think it's the same policy initiatives that we need to make our communities have them develop baseline resiliency. So that's Medicare for all, so that folks don't see thousands of dollars of premiums and copays leave their budgets. That's a livable wage that permanently adjusts to inflation, so people can actually afford to be in communities. That means investments in building housing and investments in our housing choice voucher program, so that folks don't see over 50% of their monthly income go to housing costs. That's investments in renewables so people can afford fuel prices. All of these things that we know are so important to the economic resiliency of communities, we need to actually do them.
Okay, thank you. Well, we now have time for a lightning round before the end of the debate. Now, candidates, please keep your answers to 10 seconds or less here. And we will begin. What role, if any, does faith play in your policy positions? Lieutenant Governor.
I was not raised with any particular religious background, but I do spend a lot of time outside and worship this state that we are so lucky to live in.
Thank you. Dr. Myers.
I respect everyone's faith. I think it's at the core of many people's being. So we welcome all faiths, and I respect them all.
Thank you.
I think my faith is core to my policy perspective, and core to my faith is that we take care of each other and we love each other.
Thank you. And Senator Ballant.
I think very deeply every day about just like me. That is my faith, which is just like me. My neighbor is struggling with the same things that I'm struggling with. So not as much on policy, but how I approach my work each day.
All right. Do you support some form of universal basic income, a proposed strategy to alleviate poverty by regularly sending every citizen a set amount of money? We'll start with Dr. Myers.
You know, I didn't a few years ago, but as I start to look at some of the data that's coming in, some of the where it's been tried in certain communities and certain states, the data's strong that it actually does decrease poverty and
yes
stress.
Or no?
That's a qualified yes.
All right. Senator Ballant.
Yes, I find it very intriguing. And as the doctor said, the studies coming out have shown when you put more money in people's pockets, it helps child development, it helps health and well-being in families.
Okay. And Shanae Chase Clifford.
Resounding yes.
Would you like to elaborate?
Nope.
All right, Lieutenant Governor.
I'm open to considering it after we figure out childcare and paid family and medical leave and housing and health care to start.
Question number 3. What is one thing that helped you through the most difficult parts of the pandemic? Senator Ballant.
Oh, I did Mad Libs with my kids for hours every night when we were in lockdown and we couldn't go out. And my daughter said to me the other day, those were some of the happiest times in the pandemic, was doing Mad Libs together.
Shanae Chase Clifford.
Yeah, it's hard to pick one thing, but my family, my husband, they're a really good time, and they can make any kind of dark moment feel like it's the happiest.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
Oh, certainly my husband, Mike, and our 2 stepkids, Benny and Elliot. Maybe they're watching tonight. Hi, guys.
And Dr. Myers.
Well, you know, I worked in the hospital through the COVID. I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think this was not my first rodeo, is the way I look at it. I trained during the AIDS epidemic, which to me was much more dangerous as a healthcare provider. One needle stick at that time was fatal. So there was a certain fatalism about it.
Okay, and this will be our final lightning round question. What's one major policy issue you have changed your mind on? We'll start with Sinead Chase Clifford.
I think there are, I maybe when I first showed up to the Hill,
Unfortunately, that is time.
Oh my God. Well, then there you go, everybody.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
My thinking certainly developed around telehealth. I didn't fully appreciate what it offers for Vermonters, and having spent a lot of time over the last year talking to folks around the state, telehealth, broadband access, those are critical for everything.
And Dr. Myers.
Well, I'll go back to the universal basic income, which I'm evolving on because I'm looking at the data and realizing it has some possibilities.
And Senator Ballant.
I can't point to anything in particular that changed overnight, but certainly my ideas have evolved on so many things, and we have to continue to be curious.
Okay.
All right, we have time now for 1-minute closing statements from each candidate. The order was predetermined randomly before the show, and Dr. Lewis Myers, you will start us off. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. And I'm honored to be here with VPR and Vermont PBS. I have spent 30 years saving lives, or trying to. And when I couldn't save a life, at least make it better. I see this as a continuation. I see running for office as a continuation of that effort. Being in a position in Washington where a bill could save millions of lives, that is my goal. I consider myself a moderate, or what I call a realistic Democrat. I'm going to be directed less by policy ideology and more by what will work and what we think can pass.
Thank you. Next in our randomly generated order is Sinead Chase Clifford.
It has been fun to share the stage with you all, and maybe I'll take a second to answer the last question about how I've changed my mind. I think I've actually really grown in my understanding of how important love is in everything we do, and how approaching policy with an analytical mind is important, but we have to center love and care and compassion in everything that we do. I hope this evening that you have seen that I am a candidate who is fiercely focused on policy solutions. And what I want to offer our state is a true progressive option, one supported by the Vermont Progressive Party, and an entirely new vision of what politics can be and who we can be as Vermonters, and what our representation can look like. I will close with a quote, which is my favorite thing to do. This one from Bell Hooks: "We collectively regain our faith in the transformative power of love by cultivating courage, the strength to stand up for what we believe in, and to be accountable in both word and deed." Thank you.
Next up is Senator Ballant.
So thank you all for listening tonight. What I want to say to you tonight is I am a mom, I am a longtime teacher, and I am an experienced legislator. But most of my life, I really felt like an outsider. And that's not because I didn't have powerful connections. It was because as a gay kid, I felt like an outcast, and felt that there were times when I certainly felt like people were looking down on me. So I carried that with me into the classroom. I tried to make my classroom a place where everyone felt welcome and supported. I brought that same lens into the State House with me, making sure that we were crafting policy to take care of all Vermonters. And I want to say, I promise you that if you send me to Congress, I will work so hard on your behalf, and I will fight so hard to protect this democracy. Thank you.
And finally, Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray, your closing statement, please.
Thank you, hosts. Thank you, candidates. And thank you to all the Vermonters tuning in tonight. As we conclude this evening, we know that the January 6th hearings are underway, that our democracy is fragile. We know that war is still raging in Ukraine. We know that gun violence is one of the greatest challenges we face. We know that climate change is impacting everything we know and love. We know that fundamental rights are under attack. We're at the end of COVID, I hope, and inflation is on the rise. I know without question it's time for my generation to step up, and I'm stepping up. And this is what I bring. I bring roughly half a decade of time working in and with Congress. I bring experience working with the International Committee of the Red Cross, working overseas in conflict zones. I bring a legal background, working to protect and uphold the Constitution, not only in our federal court system, but as an assistant attorney general. And I bring experience working as your lieutenant governor, working across the aisle, working every day with civility, with kindness to bridge the divide.
And that is time.
Thank you.
This concludes the primary debate for Democrats running for U.S. House on VPR Vermont PBS. Thanks to the candidates who joined us tonight: Shanae Chase Clifford, Senator Becca Balint, Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray, and Dr. Lewis Myers.
Join us again for our next debate a week from today. That's Thursday, June 16th, when we'll speak with the Republican candidates for Lieutenant Governor. The VPR Vermont PBS and 7 Days debate was produced by Matthew Smith, Tedra Meyer, Brian Stevenson, Holt Albee, Mike Dunn, Dave Rice, Frank Allwine, Peter Angish, and James Stewart.
Our music is by Eric Ewazen and the New Trombone Collective. I'm Chelsea Edgar for 7 Days.
And I'm Mikaela Lefrak with VPR and Vermont PBS. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll catch up again soon.